All right, we are happening.
All right, McLaurin, welcome to Living in Scriptures Live. We are looking back this week at Revelation chapter 11. And if you were there with us on Sunday, I said this passage is probably the one that has the most divergent viewpoints in the book of Revelation. But regardless of where you land on how the two and who the two witnesses are, I think the big message is the same, that when we live for Jesus wholeheartedly, that's the best and greatest evangelism that we will ever do. More than words, more than anything else. If we live for Jesus wholeheartedly and proclaim him in our life as well as in our speech, things change. That we are more dangerous to the kingdom of Satan uh, than anything else. We are more dangerous when we are living for Jesus. And one of the things I said was that I've been a Christian for about 30 odd years, and I have noticed over the 30 odd years that it has become, I think, harder to be a Christian. And I thought I'd ask you guys your experience, your reflections on that. What does it mean to be a Christian? Has it been harder in the last decades?
Well, I would say um, it hasn't been harder to be a Christian. And when I tell people about Jesus or that I'm a pastor, that I'm a follower of Christ, I don't usually get any more negative feedback than ever before. In fact, usually it's positive. But on certain issues, there's definitely a more negative feedback. If I start talking about my convictions when it comes to sexual orientation or something like that, there's probably a stronger negative feedback to any views like that than the mere fact that I'm a follower of Christ.
I think I would agree with that, and I think it has to. I think there's more for us to psych ourselves out about now. And what I mean by that is that we imagine. I think we're prone to imagine there's maybe more animosity toward us than there actually might be. Because everyone seems to be angry and agitated and wanting to shut down everybody else. So I think we perpetuate that a little bit in our own minds by just acknowledge, and not thinking, oh, well, maybe actually people wouldn't give me grief for being Christian. And on the same token, I think Brian's right. And it's kind of funny how we've got this shift toward tolerance and openness, and at least in word, but it seems in practice, perhaps that's not necessarily the case when it comes to sincerely held convictions or beliefs that actually about a moral framework that might apply to everybody, or a certain belief that might apply to everyone. People are happy, I think, for you to be a Christian because that's just you being you, this individual expression. But as soon as we say, well, you ought to follow Christ too. God is his existence means something for your life as well. As long as we do that, if we make any absolute claims, then I think there's a lot more. It's a lot harder of a discussion to have, and there's a lot more maybe difficulty that way.
Yeah, I would tend to agree in some of that, but definitely feel like in the years that I've become a Christian, just even standing for Christ, you stand out a little bit more. You stand out a little bit more. And maybe I should ask the question in this light then. In First Peter chapter 3, it says, always have, always be ready to give a reason for your faith. Obviously, people who looked at Peter and said something's different about this person, and they ask a reason for their faith. So I'm going to ask the question, are we living that? And maybe the question I really have is, what kind of lifestyle would we live in order for people to ask us? Like, what kind of hope do you have? And maybe it's also to share. Is there a time when somebody looked at you and said, hey, I want to know more about why you do the things you do? Um, and I can think of probably, like, if you ask me that, one of them is just neighbors asking us about our marriage and how it's different than
Hmm.
it seems like others are. And I think that's one of them. But, even deeper, like, why aren't people, maybe I'm also asking myself the question, why aren't people asking that question more often?
Hmm.
Well, from my kind of experience is that people sometimes don't make the connection between what is different about us and what the reasons are for that difference. For example, I've had a number of people say to me, man, you're lucky to have been married that long. Like as if it's luck. It's not. It's luck that I picked the right partner that I connect with and can be friends with after 35 years. But it has nothing to do with luck. It's biblical principles, right? That we have based our marriage on, and those principles translate into a lasting, healthy marriage. But people don't make that connect oftentimes. They think it's just,
Hmm.
coincidence that this happened. And so they don't ask you what you did in order to have a good marriage. They just think it's luck or something else.
Yeah. And I mean, kind of along those lines, maybe not luck, but I've had some people, a couple of conversations are coming to mind where people have said, well, you're such a good person, Caleb. You're just this good guy, and that's just great. And I'm like, I'm not good.
So then
I
how
know
do you
how
guys
to act.
respond?
I know how to act differently, but like and you just want people to you want them to look away from you and to say no, it's something different. And I think that the fact that I'm a good person actually does, like, the fact that they see that, I think they do associate that with God. Like they may not want to give God the credit in the same way that I do, but one of the things that I say is you know what, but the reason I'm not a good person, sure, if you want to go with that language, I'm not a good person because of me. There are, like, God is real. His wisdom is real. His truth is real. If you believe it, then it makes a difference. But my life, if I do what God says, and if I seek Him the way that He commands, and if I'm living out of the fullness of His Spirit, well, that isn't me then, is it? That's not me. That's His wisdom at work. That's His love at work. That's His kindness at work, and that's His principles on display. So I can't take credit for any of that, and it isn't about the person. I'm just walking in this way, and the amazing thing is I can do that as a sinful, broken person. I can walk in this way, and good things can happen, and I can be a good person, if you want to use those words. And that's what I hope that they see, is that there's actually a set of wisdom and a set of beliefs and a set of principles that can be understood and can be adopted by faith. Like, you can, and Jesus said this, whoever hears these words of mine and puts them into practice. Well, we all can hear these words, and whoever will do it will show that the teaching is not a human teaching, it comes from God, and their life will be the evidence of that, I think.
Yeah, and one thing I say to people when they don't see the connection, I say, I believe that there is a Father in heaven, and He is the creator. He made me, and He gave me a manual on how I work best. And I read that manual. It's His word, the Bible, and I try my best to live by that manual. And that's how things work. They work well when we put that into practice.
And I think that's kind of the, giving that hope we have in Jesus. And I do believe that as time goes on, that if we were to live the Christian life, and if Jesus is kind of our all in all, we might start to look more different than the world, more different in the way we use our money, like in how open-handedness, generosity, maybe in simplicity, in the fact that maybe we have more peace, that we're not given over to the outrage and the instantaneous jerk back, and maybe it's also the hope that we have when things kind of go awry in our lives. And I think those are those opportunities in order that we might have in order to share the gospel, and it makes it more real to, well, those who are looking in. And so I do think that there's a lot of opportunity out there in order to share. And I think just living, and I like what you said, Brian, about God has given us a manual in life. And if we live by them, there will be a more fullness of life. And I think the outside world will see more and more of that as time goes on. I think that's what I believe. That's about all that I have. Do you guys have any comments or thoughts on the weekend?
The one thought I had was this whole, it starts out with the measuring line and measuring the temple, but not the outer courts. And I think you did a great job of, explaining how it was kind of the God's people, and measuring is kind of protecting and ownership, and the outer courts, that was the Gentiles or non-believers, that they're not part of God's family, and there's a distinction there between the two groups. Anyway, one application that I kind of thought about for myself, I'm not sure if it can really be drawn from this text or not, but where do I measure in my own life? Like, where do I draw the line in terms of what's really important? And I had to ask myself, how often do I actually end up measuring the outer courts, the things that don't really matter, that are not really part of the kingdom of God, that I shouldn't be focusing on, but they're so tempting because, I like what I see there or whatever. Anyway, so that was one kind of thought that came to me through that I shouldn't be focused measuring the temple.
That's a great thought.
Yeah. I appreciated the discussion of how in the past, like when you have prophecies of judgment in the past, God preserves a remnant, and it's a small amount, it's a 10%, and we talked about how it's different this time. Here it's in this judgment there's a 90%. That was this week, right? That was a part of what came out this week. Yeah. And how it's the things have turned, and so now there's 90% instead of 90%, falling away from God and being kind of lost or cast off, while God preserves this small remnant. It's a reversal where there's a judgment that fall on 10% who are, recalcitrant. They don't want to repent, or they're consistently, they've just chosen their way, and God is not in the equation at all. And so they run headlong into God's judgment, but then 90% they turn and they give praise to God. That's such a beautiful kind of shift of and progression, and it speaks to the heart of God, I think, and his desire for his desire and just his work, the work that he's doing in the world. It's so much different now, in the kingdom than it was before Christ and before the Spirit, where it seemed like Israel could barely hold on, and God, they could barely keep faithful to God, and even around the time Jesus came, there was questions of would there still be faith, and yet now the kingdom is expanding throughout the earth, and God's blessing is just being poured out and poured out and poured out, and it's a really exciting thought.
Yeah, that was one of the things that really struck me, right? Like, this is revival. If it's true that 90% actually then glorify God. Like, how often does that happen? And it really kind of struck me that, the catalyst for this like explosion is really the witnesses who are willing to live for Jesus no matter what, even if their life was on the line. And that idea of that's how much Jesus is worth to us. And I think, when I think about that, Brian, when you talked about the measuring line, I didn't make that same connection, but as I read this passage, it made me really think, do I live in such a way that people will see that Jesus is my all in all? And embarrassingly, there are lots of times when I don't, right? Like, the measuring line kind of goes a little bit past and you're like, okay, I got this and that. And that's not to say that God is a joy kill or a killjoy and he's not for our good. Well, I think the when we seek, as you guys have said, when we seek after Jesus, that's the fullest life we could ever have. And just as he said, seek ye first the kingdom of heaven and all these things. Not like he says that you're just going to lose all these things. He says all these things will be added. Right? After all, we are to inherit the earth, and that's not a prosperity thing. It is the truth that God created us, and God is a good God, and that's a reflection of that. And he's kind of saying, come this way to have life. Come this way to have life. This is the fullness of life. This is what I've designed for the fullness of it. And so, I really did think about that a little bit of like, okay, really, how does my life reflect Jesus as the center and in all things? Because if that's the case, like I said, I think that is going to be the greatest evangelism the world will ever see. Not just by words, not just by whatever. It's kind of what Paul said, the entire palace guard, I'm in jail because of the gospel. And they're like, wow, really? It means that much to you? And it's like, yeah, it does. And you know what? To live as Christ, to die as gain. I'm all in. And it's just like, wow.
Yeah, no, totally. That's pretty fantastic. The other thought that came to mind too is just with the two witnesses, being related to Moses and Elijah, and the witness being, these kind of prominent people. But then I'm reminded of what we went over in this Sermon on the Mount, where in the Beatitudes, where he starts by saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit," and he kind of pronounces God's blessing on these people, and this blessing transforms them. So he says at the end, he says, "Blessed are you when you're persecuted for righteousness' sake, for so they persecuted the prophets before you." And I've seen that as like God pronouncing the type of transformation that happens in the kingdom, where God meets people where they're at, broken and poor in spirit, and his blessing follows them and transforms them so that they are like the prophets of old. And so I do think that this is the church. I do think that this is us who has this prophetic witness, and we can. It's something that we do, but it also comes out of God's blessing, like just the work that he's done in our life. And that just speaks to what you said at the beginning, Peter, about like, how is God transforming our life, and where do we see that? I think perhaps maybe in a closing thought then, the prophets and the ministry of the prophets was one of life, but it was also one of speaking. And it was more often than not, and the same with Jesus. I mean, it wasn't the healing, it wasn't the other things that they got upset with him for, maybe a little bit, but what he said, the truth that he spoke was a hard thing for. That was what really got him in the hot water. I think we need to be speaking truth, and not in such a way to be flamboyant, but just pointed truth, because those are spirit-filled words that Jesus spoke, and we should not be afraid to take them for ourselves as well.
100%. Like you said, I don't think our calling is to be obnoxious, but there are times when the gospel also will offend, and that was kind of mentioned, right? Because if the gospel is true, then we are sinners. If the gospel is true, Jesus is Lord and we're not, and those things people don't like that, right? Like, and that's going to be a little bit of that divide.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts as we kind of wrap up?
no, just really appreciate, chance to chat about this and to review it through our Sunday services. If anyone's watching and would love to join us, come out for a Sunday or reach out, send us a message, and we'll connect with you more. It'd be great.
100%.
All right.
Looking forward to that. All right. Thanks for joining us. That's life here at McLaurin. Blessings.
Yeah, you bet.
All right. We'll see you.